The word Hopepunk originates with a Tumblr post from 2017. Quote, "The opposite of grimdark is Hopepunk. Pass it on." Hopepunk says that kindness and softness don't equal weakness, and that in this world of brutal cynicism and nihilism, being kind is a political act, an act of rebellion. The author of said Tumblr post, Alexandra Rowland, would later write a longer essay about Hopepunk and what they saw as its defining features. But by that point, the term had already escaped containment. It entered the online mainstream, I think, with the publication of an article by Vox writer Asia Romano, who describes Hopepunk as being characterized by, among other things, a weaponized aesthetic of softness, wholesomeness, or cuteness, an emphasis on community building through cooperation rather than conflict, and a worldview that argues that the fight to build positive social systems is a fight worth fighting. So, okay, putting aside whatever we might think about the specifics for now, is something a genre just because someone decides it should be? Hopepunk isn't a descriptor I hear people use outside of conversations about Hopepunk. Looking through Romano's examples of relevant media, there are so many subgenres I'd reach for to describe each before getting to Hopepunk. For instance, included in the list is The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin. If I'm recommending that book to someone, I'm gonna call it fantasy. Maybe dark fantasy? What does it mean to say it's also Hopepunk? If a genre is defined in a forest and no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound? The question underlying this, of course, is what is a genre? One definition would be that it's a way of categorizing art, that we can create a precise taxonomy of all works of fiction based on factors like setting, tone, format, etc., which would tell us something meaningful about these works. But 100% accurate definitions of anything are difficult, never mind something as slippery as a genre. Trying to draw hard boundaries between categories so often just leads to the policing of their meaning. For now, let's take the thing on its own terms. Romano admits that, quote, "Depending on who you ask, Hopepunk is as much a mood and a spirit as a definable literary movement." Hopepunk is defined not by its contents, but its philosophy. It's perhaps less of a category and more of a lens through which we can look at texts. How does thinking about The Fifth Season as Hopepunk change how we interpret that book? Well, it draws the focus to a different place, puts the emphasis on the fact that characters do survive, despite the trauma and hardship they face in the process. This is a way genre functions sometimes. When someone makes the case that Star Wars is fantasy, not science fiction, they're arguing for a different way of looking at the story. It emphasizes maybe the Force as a kind of magic, the importance of bloodlines and princesses over the presence of spaceships. Still, I don't think many would say that that's the primary purpose of the term fantasy. There are plenty of non-fantasy works for which trying to apply the term would be confusing, rather than illuminating. The most obvious critique of Hopepunk, and one plenty of people have made, is that its definitions often talk in the same breath of stories about persisting despite adversity, and cozy, upbeat stories where nothing bad happens. And this is a Venn diagram composed of two circles. Rowland solves this problem by insisting that it's only the former that's Hopepunk. Quote, "It's not about glory or noble deeds. It's not about an end result because there is no end. There's always a tomorrow, and when the sun rises again, we'll still have a dam holding the water back. For now. But entropy is real, and dams must be maintained, and it takes all of us to do it, and it's done by linking arms with the people next to you, by building a community with deliberate intent. Take bloodthirsty, vengeful joy where you can, because the night is dark and the fight is long, and there are no knights in shining armor waiting in the wings to slay the dragon at just the right moment of dramatic tension." That, apparently, is what they want Hopepunk to be. But it's definitely the other vision of the genre that's been popularized, the nice, feel-good, cozy time. And while that kind of escapism can be fun, I'm skeptical of its political potential. It so easily falls into a kind of toxic positivity that disallows explorations of the issues it claims to be addressing. It's much easier to be upbeat when you're not the one whose personhood is on the line. Romano says that self-care is Hopepunk, and this is the point at which I went, oh, this whole thing smacks of gender. The term self-care means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, but in its worst, most commercialized form, it's a term I associate with skincare and bubble baths, with a kind of emotion-based language that gets coded as feminine. If grimdark is toxic masculinity, the worst versions of Hopepunk are girl boss white feminism. Both attempt to solve a structural problem by addressing surface-level symptoms. The issue with grimdark storytelling isn't the depiction of pain and suffering, it's the ways they're depicted, and who is allowed the ability to depict them in the first place. If Hopepunk was an anomaly, I wouldn't be so interested in talking about it. But in fact, people keep reinventing this idea. Hopepunk is one in a string of these so-called subgenres that define themselves in opposition to grimdark. Roland's essay contrasts Hopepunk to one of these, saying that, quote, "In Noblebright, when we overthrow the Dark Lord, the world is saved and our work is done. Equilibrium and serenity return to the land. Our king is kind and good and pure of heart. That's why he's the king." In other words, Noblebright assumes the world is, or at least can be, good and just, and in doing so mistakes complacency for utopia. Which would be a reasonable critique, except that isn't how proponents of Noblebright define it. Author C.J. Brightly, for instance, writes that in Noblebright's stories, quote, "The world wasn't perfect, but good characters exist and can make a difference in their world and society through actions defined by honesty, integrity, and sacrifice. Noblebright fantasy is not utopian fiction. The world of a Noblebright story is not perfect, and indeed can sometimes be quite dark. Actions have consequences, and even good characters can make terrible mistakes." Which is pretty close to how Roland talks about Hopepunk. The other thing about Noblebright, which in retrospect people seem to be constantly talking around but unwilling to say outright when explaining how their anti-grimdark is different, is that Noblebright is an explicitly Christian project. Or, okay, in fairness to the Noblebright people, they do not claim the concept as exclusively Christian, but it is expressly motivated by Brightly's own Christianity and his desire for more fantasy fiction that aligns with his Christian values. I don't want to assume the worst without having read any of these people's books, but as a queer person in our current political climate, I am wary of anyone talking about how we need more good Christian fantasy. I would not feel comfortable having a friendly argument about genre definitions with such a person. Valuing goodness and hope is only so meaningful. Everyone wants there to be good in the world. The problem is that we often have incompatible ideas of what is good and what is evil. An alternate way to define genre is that it's social, constituted by the creatives that define it and their dialogue with one another. The writer Lincoln Michel has an article on this subject I really like, in which he writes, quote, "Why are some terrifying mythological monsters, e.g. zombies and vampires, placed in horror, and other terrifying mythological monsters, e.g. dragons, placed in fantasy? The answer, I think, is that genre is always historical and cultural. Over the course of literary history, different elements and tropes have gotten associated with different genre labels. I am not included in the social sphere of Christian fantasy, and so I am not interested in Noblebright. Perhaps this is a useful way of thinking about Hopepunk. If it isn't coherent as a set of works joined by similar tropes and aesthetics, is it coherent as a movement? Do Hopepunk writers follow one another on social media, meet up at conventions? I don't think so, though I'd love to be wrong. The third iteration of anti-grimdark I want to talk about is called Sweetweird. In her Sweetweird manifesto, author Charlie Jane Anders defines it as, quote, "Stories that feature lovable characters and a focus on supportive chosen family, set against worlds that are, shall we say, somewhat tarnished and bizarre. Where weirdness has frequently been paired with misanthropy and nastiness, Sweetweird stories can be incredibly strange, and yet lovely." Much of this resembles the genres we've already talked about. But what's interesting to me is that, in addition to Sweetweird being optimistic, Anders identifies this other axis of weirdness. And far more so than with Hopepunk, I think she may have genuinely identified a trend here, in that if I tilt my head just right, I can see an aesthetic through line in her examples. Or maybe I'm just biased. Sweetweird is the opposite of Noblebright for me, in that the implicit social context is that of queer SFF fandom. Still, many of the same issues exist here in terms of whether this even counts as a genre. All of her examples are things she is labeling as such after the fact. Echoing Romano, Anders writes, quote, "Arguably, Sweetweird is my attempt to define something that's an aesthetic as much as a genre or a movement. Or maybe it's a feeling." Another often suggested way of looking at genre is that it's a marketing tool, or less cynically, it's a communication tool. If you like this thing, you might like this other thing that's similar. In this context, maybe there is value in defining a genre based on tone. If you like stories that are sweet and weird, check out a Sweetweird book. You'll notice that this is a far cry from that first Tumblr post claims that, quote, "calling your senators is Hopepunk." Whatever value exists in the anti-grimdark, it's one of aesthetic preference, not material politics. If any subgenre has made an attempt at being politics, it's probably solarpunk. Multiple people seem to have independently arrived at the term, but the version I'm most familiar with originates, like Hopepunk, with a Tumblr post. Notably, the post starts with aesthetics. Part of the project here is to make this vision of the future desirable on a sensory level. The author also doesn't attempt to claim extant works as already being solarpunk. She is asking people to create this genre, not pretending the artistic revolution's over before it's even started. The result of all this is that when a book like A Psalm for the Wild-Built advertises itself as solarpunk, I have at least a vague idea of what that means. Academic Rhys Williams, in his paper The Shining Confluence of Magic and Technology, Solarpunk, Energy Imaginaries, and the Infrastructures of Solarity, points out the ways many solarpunk fantasies fall short. The stories emphasize communities making use of theoretically eco-friendly tech, but for all that sustainability is the name of the game, little attention is paid to how the characters are maintaining their high-tech lifestyle. Who is constructing these solar panels? Who is mining the metals used in their production? Because it's never our protagonists. When I started this essay, I thought solarpunk was going to be another Hopepunk-like, but there's a specificity to solar that's lacking in hope. It's actionable. While not without its own flaws, after the other genres we've discussed, the mere fact that solarpunk has a coherent enough ideology to be critiquable is a breath of fresh air. Because these conversations about the practicalities of solar-powered living are ones we need to be having. Solarpunk defines itself in relation to cyberpunk. Instead of sharp glass and neon, it's soft fabrics and lush greenery. Hopepunk and its siblings, on the other hand, define themselves against grimdark. Which brings us to the question, what do we mean by grimdark? The term originates from the tabletop game Warhammer 40k, where, in the grim darkness of the future, there is only war. Various fantasy authors and fans later took up the term in a less tongue-in-cheek way to describe dark fantasy like Game of Thrones and its contemporaries. People often position the genre as itself a subversion of classic fantasy, a deconstruction of Tolkien and his worlds of capital G good and capital E evil. One of the bigger critiques of grimdark fantasy is the way it can seem to revel in subject matter it maybe shouldn't. Graphic depictions of violence towards women or other bigotry in a genre where the big names are overwhelmingly white men. And I think it's mostly this kind of broody white guy grimdark that people are gesturing towards when they describe their new genre as its opposite. But there are plenty who'll say the core appeal of grimdark can be found in a breadth of works from a diverse variety of authors, that grimdark is any story that looks the worst parts of reality in the eye and refuses to blink. One article I read, for instance, includes in its list of examples, The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin. I was wrong. Genre isn't a set of aesthetics, or a historically situated movement, or a marketing category. It's a snake eating its own tail. What are we doing? Because, I have a hard time believing that any of this fine-grained categorization matters to the publishing industry writ large. As a writer, it can be easy to stress over whether your work is more space opera or science fantasy, but in my experience, even avid readers who just don't happen to follow speculative fiction barely think about the difference between fantasy and sci-fi. Still, to jettison the argument out onto genre definitions are arbitrary and don't matter, while true, seems to avoid the philosophical divide beneath the buzzwords. There is value in imagining hopeful futures. The Dispossessed made the case for anarchism to me far more compellingly than any nonfiction work yet has. Fans of dark fiction will sometimes talk about realism. If violence exists in the real world, why shouldn't our art reflect that? And fair enough. But I also think we shouldn't underestimate the value of demanding the impossible. All the same, fiction cannot be our only tool. One of the people quoted in Romano's Hopepunk article published back in 2018 is a spokesperson for a nonprofit who, to quote their website, used the power of story and popular culture to make activism accessible and sustainable, which was called, at the time, the Harry Potter Alliance. I don't know about you, but these days I don't associate Harry Potter with positive political change. Potter is an especially pointed example, but it is not exceptional. Stories and aesthetics and ideas come in and out of vogue, carry different political valences in different times and places. If your activism is founded on art and nothing else, it can and will collapse out from under you at any moment. Our fiction must be built on our politics, not the reverse. The structures of power have long since demonstrated their ability to reincorporate and commodify almost anything. Self-care, feminism, the list goes on. To assume that an aesthetic movement is immune to being co-opted is to lose the fight before you've even started. There is no ethical genre under capitalism. I want to end this video on a kind of counterexample. Last year at a zine fest here in Minneapolis, I bought a book called Make the Golf Course a Public Sex Forest. As the editors describe it, the title originated as a joke related to ongoing controversies around the future of a local golf course. Quote, "Recently, momentum has developed to alter the golf course in order to mitigate its destructive environmental impact. Various plans have been floated, ranging from closing portions of the course so that the lake can resume its natural borders, to shutting down the course completely and turning the land into a food forest for everyone in the city to explore and eat. We think this last idea is amazing. Our only objection is that it doesn't go far enough." The book itself is an anthology, a mixture of poetry and erotica and political theory and works that live in the muddy boundaries between those categories. The sex forest here becomes a metaphor, as much as it is a literal idea, a stand-in for the world we want to build. The original proposal reads to me as being born of frustration. If the more quote-unquote reasonable plans to replace the golf course are unlikely to succeed, why not ask for the most radical alternative we can think of? I suppose you could call it solar punk, what with all the greenery, but that doesn't capture the whole of it. Part of what's interesting about the book in the context of this essay is that it is an optimistic vision of the future, but it is not, by any means, wholesome. It's weird and horny and gross, and in places kind of cringe. I love this book because it isn't part of a genre, because it refuses to be held back by something so inane. It doesn't need to be marketable, it doesn't need to fit in one section of the bookstore or another. It's not waiting for a literary movement to justify its optimism. It's not hoping. It's making a demand. Hi, okay, that's the video. Doing a little video essay outro thing this time, you know how video essays do, because I am starting a Patreon. I will put the link on the screen, I assume, and you can go there and support me. I'm gonna do, you know, the usual things. I'll do like patron name credits in future videos, and that'll be fun. I also want to do bonus content on the Patreon. I think I'm gonna do it as like a podcast, I guess. I was conceiving of these originally as bonus videos where I could sort of talk about other media I'm interested in sort of a more casual review-ish kind of way. But I think in order to keep it with that sort of casual energy, I don't want to do video editing, so it's going to be audio only. This first one is about the ongoing season of Doctor Who. Yeah. Thank you for watching.